is a very interesting book, this Exodus. Bob already opened up for us how it deals with the children of Israel. Um, and we're called to look into it in our sermon series, and it's a real event. It's a real thing that happened, and the first chapters of it give us. First of all, it says that there were about 70 people who came, and they were the chosen people of God. They were the people that God had chosen. They weren't different people from anybody else, but they were the ones that God had chosen. They were just as faulty and just as the same as we are. God had selected them. And in the land, they were called Haburai. They were called the shepherds, the ones that tended the flocks. And as the Egyptians thought that this was a very lowly job, lowly thing to do. They didn't want anything to do with this kind of work. And so they were set where the Nile Delta comes into the Mediterranean. It's very fruitful land. And apparently, not land was only good for shepherding, it was good for the Hebrew people, or the children of Israel. Because it says, "But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." It's noteworthy to remind yourself that only 70 people came, and they started to, through years of staying there, they started to grow. But they stayed separate. They didn't become Egyptians, but they stayed the children of Israel. They maintained their identity, and they grew in number. And where you can read in Numbers that when they left Egypt, there were 600,000 males of age between 20 and 50 years old. If you add children and women and men under 20 or over 50, you're looking at people about 2 to 3 million. So it's a very large population that we're talking about already at this time. The promise was given to Abraham that his children would become like the sand on the shore or the stars in the sky. But in verse 8, it says, "Now there rose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Look, the people of children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal with them shrewdly, lest they multiply, and it happen that in the event of war, they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land.' Therefore they sent taskmaster over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh a supply cities of Pithom and Ramses." Now, this time is a new kingdom of Egypt. The old one happened about 2,000 years before, and the old kingdom of Egypt, they believed in one God called the Truth. And the lesser gods had slowly started to come into the picture when Joseph comes down into the scene of the late 12th dynasty, perhaps, at the beginning of the 13th. His name is Saphnath-Paneah. Many of the pharaohs of that time had the Paneah in their name. And their religion still had reverence to the singular God of truth. We have to understand that looking back far enough, we're coming back to Noah and his descendants who got off the ark. So still was a lingering knowledge of the singular God, even though during this time the spiritual scene had become filled with idols and different kinds of gods. And just this morning downstairs with Mervi, we discussed what does Finland look like? How can this happen? That a nation that knows one God that they call the truth becomes a nation of multiple gods, that all kinds of very strange traditions. But if you look at Finland now, when I was going to school, we learned in the book that Finland is 99.9% Lutheran Christian. And in my lifetime, has that percentage gone maybe below 50? I don't know what it is even today. But how can a nation go so wrong so quickly? In the 13th dynasty, the area downriver, north, is ruled by the Hyksos kings. They were called the shepherd kings. During this time, they ruled the area about 300 years. And this seemed to be the favorable time of the Hebrews in the area, perhaps because the kings were also shepherds. But when Amis, the Pharaoh, comes up the river Nile, so he comes down, he goes up the river, but he comes down, and he takes over the land. Amos has his son called Thutmose, who ends up having ends up having a young boy who dies at a young age. Then he has a son through a second wife, who he calls Thutmose the second, who in order becomes the Pharaoh, needs a full royal wife, and he ends up marrying his half-sister, Hatshepsut. Now Thutmose and Hatshepsut, this guy, I don't know who would give this name to their daughter, but they do. They have only one child that was a girl, and again, Thutmose has a son through a second wife. Now Thutmose the third. But before Thutmose the third is able to take hold of the throne, Thutmose the second, Hatshepsut's husband, dies, and they have a son who is about 3 years old. Now Hatshepsut makes a move, and he makes the mark on his land. She takes over and becomes a pharaoh, and he becomes very successful, and he leads a war down south, and he builds temples to honor herself. And we will come back to this Hatshepsut later. But now you know where she came from. Hatshepsut did not have a son that would follow her, but ended up having her husband had a son through a second wife, again, at this, who is the Thutmose the third, right? So Hatshepsut is on power, and the one that is supposed to take over is the son of the second wife, not full royal blood. It's of the side. So she comes after Amos, who takes on the Hyksos dynasty in the Lower Egypt, which, by the way, always written about when you decipher the hieroglyphs, it says ruler of the Upper and Lower Egypt. As in comparison, before it would say only Upper Egypt, showing this change in the area. But when the ruler of Pharaoh comes, takes over both Upper and Lower Egypt. You would understand that this is important because this is what it says in the text. Look, the people of children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen, the event of war, they also join our enemies, the Hyksos kings that ruled the area, and fight against us and go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built Pharaoh's supply cities of Pithom and Ramses. Now, their legitimate fear is that the Hyksos kings would come back, and the children of Israel, they were more of them than they were the Egyptians, up the river, they could take over. It was a legitimate fear. This wasn't just there's Jewish people that, we got to deal with them. No, this was a legitimate fear that they would lose to the rebellion coming from where they were. And now these two cities that they build, Pithom, literally called the fortress of the foreigners, and Ramses, both were military cities to defend the Egyptians against the kings who they defeated. In the actual monument in Egypt, in these towns, we can read that the Fenshu built these cities. Fenshu meaning forced labor, but the word literally means bearers of the shepherd's staff, indicating that the shepherd slaves were used to build these two cities. Amis is the first one who puts the children of Israel into slavery. But this is not the Pharaoh who raises Moses. There are few more leaders come, and the situation brews for a while after this first chapter of Exodus. They become even more afraid because the next it says that the children of Israel grow even faster after their slavery. It's kind of the same today that we have where the persecution of Christians is the heaviest, it usually spreads the fastest. And I don't know, maybe it has to do with when your belly's full and everything's okay, you do nothing. But when you're in trouble, you're more likely to look upon God and you have more reason to act. And this is exactly what happens. Now they were even more, and they were not only more, they were subjugated under heavy labor. Something had to be done. So the Pharaoh tries to have their midwives kill the baby boys when they help them to give birth. There's an interesting detail in the text. When the midwives refuse to kill the baby boys, they defy the rule of the land. And it is said it's because they feared God. It wasn't that they didn't fear Pharaoh, but because they feared God more than their civil leader. You have to remember this, that they had no first book of Moses. They didn't have the law. They had the knowledge of God that we can read in the Bible, that the law of God is implanted in all our hearts. They knew this was wrong. There was no book to refer to that this is wrong, but for them it was self-evident. They didn't need to read a book. They knew that killing a baby is wrong, as we should know also. And because of their obedience to God, their own families were blessed. It tells us that this whole ordeal was much longer than a day or a week or even a year, but many years pass, during which the population of children of Israel grow, and the fear the Pharaoh has over them grows also. And to this Pharaoh has an answer. Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. This is an edict that has to do with the whole land. Pharaoh says that anybody seeing the children of Israel's young boy, they throw him in the Nile River. It's not only for the midwives anymore, but this is for anyone. I'm sure there was a propaganda war to make sure that everybody knew that this is what you had to do if you found a baby boy. In the second chapter, we're introduced to the parents of the future Moses. We're not given the Hebrew name of Moses in the text. And it says, a man of the house of Levi went and took as a wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him for 3 months. And in Hebrew 11:23 we can read, by faith Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead for his reward. And in Acts that we just in the past couple of years have preached through, Stephen says this before his stone. But when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king rose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with the people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so they might not live. At this time Moses was born and was well pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of Egyptians, and he was mighty in words and deeds. Josephus, the historian, writes about Moses being a general in the Egyptian army, that he led his troops south against the Ethiopians and had an amazing victory there. This greatly grew the wealth of the land, and we know from history that the schools that Moses went to always happened in the temples in Egypt. Temples not devoted to the one true God, but the gods of Egypt. And it says that when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, dubbed it with asphalt and pitch, so he made it waterproof, and he put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood far off to know what would be done of him. I guess they didn't think we shouldn't have children now, because if we have a baby boy, they're going to kill him. They decided to have a child even if the whole world that they knew of was against them. It was a very difficult time for the children of Israel. Because I often hear people say that, why would you want to have a child to be brought up in this world? Now, the world couldn't be much darker what it was when Moses was born. They were literally going to kill him if they found him. Their persecution was very severe, and they seemed to be in no way out. I think it's one of those things that I should also remember, that even though I see the world looking pretty dark sometimes, God has a way to change it through a baby. The miraculous way that God works seems to often come through little babies born in very difficult situations. Now they end up with the boy, and they hide him as long as they can until it's too dangerous, so they devise a plan. They make a waterproof basket, put the baby in the reeds in the water in a place where they know the Pharaoh's daughter is known to bathe. There are a few interesting facts about this. In Goshen, in the area where the Hebrew people lived, there are some parts of the branches of the river Nile which are not plagued by the crocodiles, who, by the way, are all over the river. I have personally seen the Nile crocodiles, and I would not go bathe in that river because they are huge animals. Now remember, Pharaoh wanted to kill the children of God, but here's how God placed it right back to him as we read. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw a child, and behold, baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you, for the Hebrew women, that she may nurse this child for you?" Hebrew legend says that the little Moses would not nurse off the Egyptian midwives. I have experience of this. We don't really have wet nurses anymore that would nurse your child. But when our twins were at the nursing age, my twin brother's wife also had a child. And my twin brother's wife's child was not very good at eating. So she had plenty of milk, and we had twins. And when we met in Helsinki, we were on our way to the US, we thought, why don't you nurse also our twins? Because if you have excess milk, go ahead. And our twins happily nursed. It really worked. But after the holiday of 3 months, we came back, no go. Our baby wouldn't nurse off a stranger anymore. So little children get to know their mother very quickly, and they would feel strange to nurse off another woman. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." Instead of killing baby boys, the Pharaoh is now paying salary to the mother to raise the deliverer of the people of Israel in his own household, which I find to be very appropriate, because they were oppressing the Israelites, so they themselves nursed and paid the mother to nurse the one that would take them away. Children were usually nursed at this time about 3 to 4 years old. So Moses' mother and father, they had 3 to 4 years' time with this child, during which she, her husband, and the family had to instill in him the knowledge of God, of their fathers, and the promise of deliverance from Egypt to the promised land. Any mother here who has a 3-year-old would know how they felt, and can imagine how it feel like if you know that you have this child only for the very few years. You would know that your child is only on loan. It's a fact that we also know of our children who grow older. They're only with us for a moment. And during this time is what we have to give them. And we have, even though we don't have Sunday school today, for encouragement for all the Sunday school teachers, it can be done. It was done for Moses. Do you remember Hatshepsut, the lady that I talked about? She was the Pharaoh's own, Pharaoh, and she only had a daughter. But this is a speculation, by the way, and I'll tell you why it's a speculation. But Hatshepsut only had a daughter, and the future Pharaoh was the son of another woman. So you could think that she was very desperate to have her own son, who could follow her as a Pharaoh. By adopting Moses, she could have her own son to follow her. And perhaps she thought that Moses could take over the land instead of the husband's lover's son, Thutmose III. It would fit this scenario perfectly, because Moses was learned in all Egypt had to offer, which was much at the time. He would have enjoyed the best of the land had to offer, and all the luxury and freedom offered only to the royal family. Yet after serving in the military and seeing the might of Egypt, he is drawn to see the slave people downriver in lower Egypt, because what his parents had told him some 37 years before. Now it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way, and we saw no one. He killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Earlier, we read about the midwives not killing babies because they feared God. Moses looks this way and that way, but forgets to look this way. When he thinks that no one can see and no one can get caught, he does this. Now, some years ago, I read about this test of honesty. That they made a questionnaire of 20 questions, and the students could take them, and then they'd change the papers to their neighbor, who would rate them, the correct answers and right answers, and then they would get money, $1 per one right answer. The average correct answers of all these papers that they did to multiple people was 12 right, 8 wrong. Now, they did the same test, but instead of giving the test paper your neighbor to be graded, you graded it yourself and put it in a shredder. So it disappeared. So they looked this way, and they looked that way, and guess what the score was? Average score was 18 right, 2 wrong. And it's not to say, but it illustrates that it's a very human thing to do. If you think there is no way you can get caught unless you have the Holy Spirit in your heart, you will do the wrong thing. And it's not to accuse us of anything. It's just to say that when Moses went there and he thought no one could see, he thought he could do anything. He thought he could start the deliverance of his people by killing one Egyptian at a time and hiding them in the sand, if no one knew. Just like the test subject, Moses does this to the Egyptian, and he hides him in the sand, and he thinks no one will know. And just like for us, the truth shall become known. The knowledge of the land, and we read, and when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to one of them who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? Then he said, who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. This is like an action movie scene. He has to pack his royal stuff into his royal car and drive out of the royal city before the royal carrier pigeons sent the alert. He heads his way fearing for his own life. And as I have told you, perhaps Thutmose III finally finds a good reason to get rid of this foreigner child who would have been the Pharaoh, and he can drive him out of the way to his throne. He will seek to kill Moses. It's not because Moses killed one Egyptian. It's because now there was a legitimate reason to get him out of the way. If you think about it, and really imagine how the Pharaoh family ruled over Egypt. If one of them killed one Egyptian, I don't think it was time to get rid of that royal family member. I'm sure it happened many times. But at this particular place, it was to save the feared people and having a jealous brother who really hated his guts because he was in his way. So there was an opportunity to get rid of Moses. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. There's few things that I'd like to say about this text. It was the purpose of this sermon to get us to Moses and see how he was learned in all the things in Egypt. God had raised them, gave them the best training in the best school, and the most advanced knowledge in the land available. But that did not qualify him for God's work. Moses messes it up before he even gets started. He would, in his own mind, kill all the Egyptians to free the Hebrews. But he has a learning to do. He needs to learn what only can be learned in a desert. So his path leads him to Midian, which is Saudi Arabia, as we call it in these days. He will learn most in his suffering, not in his leisure. Desert time is for all of us. It's not an elective class that we can skip. It's a class through which we will come to trust and learn about God. In a way, we can become the instruments God needs us to be, so that we may be ones that can fulfill his purpose in our lives. In all the teaching that Moses had gotten, it didn't make him ready to serve God. We also feel that we go and educate. We say that I'm not ready. I still need this, this, and this. God, I need to be this and this, and I have to have that in order to serve God. But in real reality, I think what we need is a heart humbled by our life and ready to receive what God has for us. Amen.